topic given here is that economic development may not always lead to social development. So, again, the topic is very much generic, it's open ended, and it says that economic development ed may not always lead to social development. So if I'm there to start the topic, first of all I would define what do we mean by economic development, or what are the parameters that we cover in economic development, what do we mean by social development, and what are the parameters that fall in social development. There might be overlapping of the parameters, right? That some of the parameters of social and economic development might be one and the same, while some parameters may not be common. For example, when you say economic and social development, you literacy rate, for example, is a social development, but it is also to a great extent accompanied by economic development, right? Economic development basically means high standard of living. So if people have high standards of living, that is also a parameter of social development. So in other words, there are certain things common to both economic and social development. There are certain things in social development which results from economic development, and there are certain things in social development which may not be the result of economic development. So if I am starting the group discussion, I would be very clear with my definition as to what do I mean by economic development, what do we mean by by social development. In economic development, we have high standards of living, we have per capita income, we have the gross domestic product, we have the levels of industrialization in a particular country. These are all economic development. But social development could be totally different. Social development basically means what kind of treatment is given to the fairer sex. What kind of whether we have gender discrimination or not, whether the level of suicide rates is high or low, is there any fair distribution of wealth or not, high level of general happiness. So this is how we have to start the group discussion. So when you get 2 or 3 minutes to think about the topic, immediately you jot down the points as to what do you mean by economic development, what do you mean by social development, do they overlap or don't they overlap, if they overlap, on what parameters they overlap, right? Look at the first sentence now. If I am to start the group discussion, I would start like this. I would say that though economic development and social development are closely linked, there might be many instances in which one may not follow the other. So I say that yes, they are closely linked, but there might be many instances in which the economic development may not follow social development. While economic development is the outcome of industrialization, liberal economic policies, abundant natural resources, and many other things, social development results from good health of the citizens of a country, low suicide rate, high levels of happiness, fair distribution of wealth, equal opportunities for everyone, irrespective of caste, class, and gender, tolerance for one another, absence of gender discrimination, spiritual advancement, and many other indicators of similar kind. So right in the very first paragraph, I have given so many parameters. For example, it is quite possible that a society is very economically developed, but it is spiritually stagnant. There are no equal opportunities for everyone. People of one particular class are treated in a different way. They have superiority over the other class. The levels of happiness are very low. There are very high suicide rate. There is no fair distribution of wealth, right? So there are social indicators or indicators of social development which may or may not be there, irrespective of the indicators of economic development, right? And he further builds on the argument by saying there are many examples of countries that are economically well developed, but in these very countries women are treated with contempt and disrespect. For example, if you have some of the Middle Eastern countries, you'll find that though they are economically well developed, women are not treated with respect. They are treated with contempt and disrespect. On the other hand, you look at some of the South Asian countries such as Thailand and Southeast Asian countries, you'll find that though they are not very well economically developed, they still treat women with great respect. So this is just one example you have given. There are many economically developed countries where ethnic conflict is rife. and where one section of society gets lion's share of the economic pie while the other sections are barely able to make ends meet. For example, if you go to Nazi Germany of 1934, I will keep on giving this example because this is a classic example. In 1934 or 35, Germany was one of the most developed nations of Europe, and still there was racial discrimination against the Jews, and they were asked to basically leave the country. So I would say, of what use is that economic development which drives its citizens mad, often resulting in low levels of happiness and sometimes suicide? So many a time, because of too much of economic development, there is no social structure, there is no social fabric, and because of that, the levels of unhappiness are very high. Sometimes the suicide rate is very high in some of the most developed countries of the world. So economic development may not always lead to happiness, which is nothing but a social phenomenon, right? Nevertheless, the author says, nevertheless, economic development is often the harbinger of many social changes, such as reduction in general levels of poverty. So reduction in poverty is only possible if there is economic development. Higher life expectancy is only possible if there is economic development. Higher standards of living, lower levels of unemployment, lower levels of crime rate and corruption. You will find that generally crime rate and corruption is directly linked to economic development. The more economically developed a particular country is, the lower the levels of crime rate and corruption, and many more. So we have two different scenarios. Again, as I told you, the first scenario is that yes, there are certain social indicators of social development. Rather, I would say there are indicators of social development which are directly driven by economic development. And on the other hand, we have indicators of social development that may or may not be driven by economic development. And here again, we have some examples of social parameters of social development that are influenced by economic development. Moreover, I believe that while economic development is a result of government's economic policies, which does have a huge impact on the growth and development of a nation, social development often stems from collective effort of people of a particular society. Now, this is a very, very important point. He says that economic development often results from government policy, government intervention, right? But social development generally results from collective development. It is basically the traditions, the culture, the cultural mores, the customs of a country that define the social development of that country. And people play a very, very important role in uplifting or in bringing about social development. Because the government cannot come and change the psyche of the people, the culture of the people, the traditions of the people, right? For example, even at the time of independence, I will give a very, very good example. Even at the time of independence in 1947, India was not a socially developed country. Even today, many of us would say that we are not a socially developed country. We might say that we are economically developing, but when it comes to social development, we are still lagging behind. Why? Because of gender discrimination, because of a female feticide, because of not giving equal opportunities to women, because of we have communal disharmony amongst the people in the country. So still we are socially not so developed as we are economically developed. When the British left India in 1947, they had almost ruled the country for 250 years. They could set up the railways, they could set up the educational institutions, they could set up the high court, they gave us the bureaucracy, but still they could not bring about the social development way back in 1947. Child marriage was still a very, very common phenomenon way back in 1947. So while the Britishers on one hand gave us the economic development, the institutions of economic development, they couldn't eradicate social development. Why? Because social development is not something that is in the hands of government, or I would say entirely in the hands of the government. To a great extent, social development is in the hands of the people of the country, the people of society, right? So it says here, for example, what might drive a wealthy young man to commit suicide? A society that gives little or no importance to spiritual and moral values will not be able to provide emotional strength to its members. Succor means strength. In such a society, there is little bonding among the members, and such a society is very likely to decline just as many economically and advanced civilizations in the past did. For example, if someone commits suicide and and the reason for committing that suicide was lack of spiritual and moral values, then is the government responsible for that? The government does not give spiritual and moral values to its citizen. It is a society that gives spiritual and moral values to its citizen. And that is how we see many examples in the past. For example, the Roman Empire was economically developed and a very powerful empire, but it collapsed, it declined because of the decline in the spiritual, moral, and social values of its citizens. So, social development to a great extent is in the hands of the citizens of the people of that country or the people of that society. Without their cooperation, without their effort, without the movement from their end, social development can never happen. And history is full of examples of societies in which there was little or no social development, though there was considerable economic progress. For example, if you look at Japan today, even today, the gender discrimination is very high, though it is one of the top economically developed countries of the world. Thus, to conclude, I would say that whereas economic development is the responsibility of the state, social development is the onus of the citizens of that state. It is far easier to eradicate poverty and bring about economic development. But to engineer social change is a task that is not only difficult but also slow and imperceptible. Why imperceptible? Because social changes take some time. You have parameters to measure economic development. You have the GDP, you have the quarterly growth, you can all do all these things, but how would you measure social change? It's very difficult to measure and difficult to track the progress. It is imperceptible. Thus, I believe that economic development may not always lead to social development. There are certain things that, yes, they might result, economic development might bring social development, but not always. So this is again a very very good topic in which you have brought down some very very good points. And you can attack, you can counter attack by giving these examples of social, and we have discussed so many good examples of British India, of the Roman Empire, right, of Nazi Germany. And there have been many civilizations who have been economically very very advanced, but still racial conflict, ethnic conflict was there and still there in those societies.